I've been sitting here touting high frequency vocab. Sometimes it's necessary to stray outside of that list. I think that there are 3-ish reasons to do it. One, when it's something that adds a lot to the plot. I could not have written Hannibal effectively without contubernium. I needed it. When it's a really compelling word, frogs are very compelling. Bald pumpkins, very compelling. Not high frequency, very compelling. Which would mean that it will probably come up again usefully in a student's working vocab. Like, my English vocab isn't only limited to the most high frequency words in English. It's okay to teach some things that will be handy to students, like frogs or bald, if they are actually going to be handy. Or third, if they are handy and teach a handy concept.
Yes, so I could not have taught Domini Secretum without the word peculium, which is a slave's personal savings, because it was incredibly important to the plot. It's nowhere on any frequency list. It might be like, if there were a infrequent words list, it would be on that. But I needed it to tell that story, and I couldn't have told it without that word.
Yeah, that happens with cultural concepts with some frequency. In the same vein, I teach the verb mentiri to my students. It's not a super high frequency word, but it becomes high frequency with them because they like to yell at each other that they're lying. And it gets them used to deponents. If you can pick something that's going to be useful and teach a handy concept, like deponents are kind of hard, let me teach you loquor, which is also high frequency. So that's a bad example. But let me teach you mentior. That is a very good reason to stray outside of a frequency list.
And I feel like I should be teaching my kids mentiras because I think that they would love that.
Very
but I haven't.
It's okay.
But I do often think about my nuggets and what do my nuggets know? And it's important to be thinking beyond, like you mentioned earlier, beyond what your kids know. But it's also really useful for you to sit back and think, well, is this something my kids can do independently? What have they learned? So I use them as an audience in my head a lot, but I do also think about what what other students might know in other programs.
Yeah, I mean, our goal is to limit the number of words. We have to do that. And this is a serious plug for limit the number of words, because students only have so much that they can end up intaking. And if you have too many vocabulary words for them to process, they simply won't remember them at all. But you do have to have enough words to tell the story you want to tell. And without imagining your audience, it's easy to accidentally write something that's way too hard. Lucia Puella Mala, which was intended for Latin 1 students, had, I think, 68. Lucia Heros for Latin 2 had 200 something. Hannibal, which is written for level 3-ish, has 300 something words. And that's about where I would want it to stay.
Yeah, and I've ranged anywhere between 150 and 350 words. And let's talk about those words, because I like breaking it down farther. Yeah, let's talk about the words. So I like to provide the total unique word count, glossed words, clear cognates, and proper names, and then give working vocabulary. And students still need skills to read a proper name, but at the same time, I feel like the burden is less. So I like to present working vocabulary as a separate way to evaluate the word count.
Yeah, well, and I want to say something here about glossing. Glossing is dangerous, y'all. It can feel like a way to game the system, but it's back to that limiting vocab. Kids aren't going to be able to read better just because you glossed 19 words at the bottom of the page. They need to understand some 98% of what's on the page to be able to read effectively. Glossing a bunch of stuff doesn't suddenly mean that they understand it. It means that they had a reference for a second. It's like when the TV fizzes out. You can and should gloss stuff more than once. When I use idioms, I typically gloss them the first couple of times that they come up. Limit your glosses.
Yes, and I'm really glad you hit that 98% number because a lot of people don't realize how high it really has to be for kids to be able to comprehend a text. Yeah. So in addition, if you're, to come back to the glossing of vocabulary, if you're glossing a word that you don't use often, gloss it every single time. If you use a word 5 times and it's spread out 5 times throughout your novella, kids aren't going to remember it. In addition, they might have stopped reading for a couple of days between their reading times. So gloss it every single
it's all in
time.
the same chapter, you're probably okay. But
Probably.
so,
And that's also true for idioms, like gloss it. Now, if you're going to use a word that's weird, like peculium, and you're going to use it a lot because it's really important to your story, maybe just gloss it the first or second time, but not every time, because at some point kids will start to be like, oh yeah, that weird P word, that's the saving the word thing.
It's so easy to fall into the trap of, they probably know this word, so that you can cut down on your glosses. That also doesn't ensure that they understand it. Like, you deciding that they probably understand it does not actually mean that they understand it. I have sometimes done that when, in my first couple of years of teaching, been like, they probably know this word. They don't. Just because you want them to have known it doesn't mean that they do. So under the circumstances, you either need to cut the word or you need to gloss it. I have very rarely had more than 3 glosses on a page, and even that number makes me feel really, really twitchy. Yeah, and you were going to mention that cognates can also be really, really dangerous, right?
Yes. So cognates can, in fact, be just as dangerous as glosses. So our vocabularies as teachers are way more robust than our kiddos.
Yeah, ask your students how many of them know the word turpitude.
Right. Yeah. It'll be interesting how many of them don't know it. You'll be so shocked. So just because a word is a cognate or is a cognate to us doesn't mean that it's an instantly recognizable word to our nuggets. I also teach middle school, so I teach 6th graders. What is a cognate to a kid who is taking Latin 1 in 9th grade is not a cognate to a kid who is taking Latin in 6th grade. So I like to think about what a word would be clear and instantly recognizable to the majority of our kids, and not just our top tier students, but our students as a group. Yes, I sometimes really enjoy polling students. Like if I'm editing something and someone says this is a cognate, or if I'm writing something, I'll be like, hey, and I'll write a word on a board. What does this word mean? And then have them tell me what they think it means.
Use your students as an audience here. Like, don't write at them or for them, but do use them as an audience. They will be able to tell you if it's comprehensible. They'll be able to tell you if it's interesting. They'll be able to tell you if it's a cognate. They are such useful humans.
They are very useful writing. And then also, I think it's also important to point out the layers of self-doubt that students can have when they're reading in another language, even when it's a word that they know. So I wrote in one of my stories, I used admirabatur because I thought surely a kid will look at this and think it means admire because it looks like admire. Like you can see the word admire. It's a clear cognate, like it's super clear. And several of my kids were like, Ms. Cunning, what does this mean? And I was like, well, what does it look like? And they were like, well, it looks like admire. I'm like, there you go. They're reading in another language. Like that's still one that I would call a clear cognate because I think it's really clear, but it has this weird tur ending on it that they're not as familiar with. And they just start to doubt themselves. That's why it's really important to choose very specifically words that you think are very clear to your students.
Well, and some of them will learn very quickly that just because they think it looks like a thing doesn't mean it is. And so then they start assuming that nothing is what it looks like. I have had kids ask me what colore is, and I feel like color is a fairly solid cognate there. But I've been asked about it by a kid who was just making sure that they weren't making an assumption. So yeah, I mean, be really, really thoughtful about what you decide a cognate is. Sometimes things are super cognate-y, which is a good adjective, in one tense, collapsus est, comes to mind, but not in a different tense. Collabitur is not a cognate.
No, it's
And,
not.
you're talking about them being dangerous. There are a number of words that are false cognates. They sound like they are cognates, and they are not. Honestus is one of those. Deliciosus. Honestus does carry a sense of like moral uprightness, but not a sense of not lyingness. So it's really tempting to say, well, yeah, but like honestus looks like honest, and so it's a better word than probus, but that's not actually a Latin idiom. So whether it looks like it's going to be comprehensible to them in Latin, it doesn't really matter, because it means that they then won't understand probus when they do see it, and they won't understand honestus if they see it, because they will have been taught that it's something else. Our end goal is for them to be able to comprehend and encounter Latin written at different periods: ancient, Renaissance, medieval, modern, and periods in between. And if that's our goal, then it's really intensely important that the vocabulary that we choose accurately reflects frequency, usefulness, and Latin idiom. So if you aren't sure if a cognate is what you mean, I recommend Glossa. I also recommend the dictionaries on latinitium.com, which are excellent. Go hang out in them for a while. And they have all sorts of loci and can help you suss out the contexts in which you would see that word. I want to talk really quickly about the editing part of the Choose Your Words process once you have a draft complete. In my editing process, my goal is usually to make sure that I've used most or all of my vocab 15-ish times each. That feels like enough that if a kid didn't know a word, they've gotten reasonable exposure to it.
Right. So that's a good goal.
Yeah.
I usually meet it with all my words, but not always.
Yeah, and it's okay to not always meet it with everything.
Right.
That can depend on length. It can depend on complexity. It can depend on what you're writing about. And so,
yeah, I mean, for my longer works, like 15 is like not really a problem, but if you're writing a short work or a work where you really only need the word like in a couple of places,
it's
then
harder.
you think, yeah, it gets harder.
So if you're running into words, like if you're control Fing your way through your novella, and I do recommend at the end printing it out, laying the whole thing on the floor and control Fing every single word. I do. You don't have to do it, but I do. And I found that's okay. I do. I found some words that way that I didn't realize I hadn't used enough. So if you're running into words either that way or whatever way you're going through your book at the end, and we'll talk about the editing process at a different time. If you're running into words you've used like 7 times or 2 times, you have some questions you need to ask yourself. Is it a high enough frequency word that the kids probably know it? Like dormire, you're probably fine. If it isn't that, gloss it or kill it. And killing it sometimes requires a little bit of rewriting. Sometimes it's worth it to gloss it because you needed that sense of it or because you don't want to rewrite a whole scene. Sometimes it's words you can't easily replace or talk around, which is where my handy kill or increase post-it note comes from, because there's actually a third option, which is find more places to put this word.
Yes. And those are all great suggestions. I have never considered printing off an entire novella and control finding it. I usually just like read through it and control find as I go, and then like jot notes down in a yellow legal pad rather
which is also a-okay. I find that I tend to like eye skip over things when I do that. So
yeah, I mean it's more thorough. Yeah, exactly. What I do know is that by the time I have written a draft of a thing, it is pulling teeth to get me to add a new word. Like if my editors are like, use this word, I'm like, nope, like, not adding new words, no new words. So once I finish a draft, before I even send it to editors, I'm doing that control find and checking to see how often I've used a word. And then reading back through it and thinking, can I axe this word? I've only used it a couple of times, or I need to gloss it. And then there are some like in the middle points where I'm like, I've used this like 8 or 9 times. And you know, it's pretty high frequency in my classroom because I throw stuffed animals around the room all the time. So like my kids know yake and, you know, yak it really well. But what do other people think? And that's where I leave a note to my editors and say things like, oh, I've only used this 8 times. Do you see another place where I could add this? Because I wasn't able to add it anymore. Or do you think I need to gloss it? Or would your kids know what this word means?
Yeah, I mean, so some of this definitely happens in the editing process, and it's okay. We've said this before and we'll say it again. It's way more important to get things on the page than to be a perfectionist about this. Please don't panic about this. This is a good thing to have in the back of your mind as you're writing and as you're working and as you're planning. This is a good thing to have at the forefront of your mind when you're doing editing. You do not need to sit there and go, oh God, I have to know which 174 words I'm going to use right now. You don't. It's okay.
Yeah. When I sat down to write my very first novella, I just like, I'm going to write this thing. And I realized very quickly that like I couldn't freak out about any of the other stuff until the end. And then it took me a very long time, but I would have never written if I had started off.
Right. And that's okay. This is okay. This is more information than you need to start. We do need to wrap up our conversation about high frequency words and things. But we're going to keep talking about words next time.
It's true. We'll be talking about action verbs, yay, and concrete nouns and their role in showing, not telling.
Until then, scribite bonis avibus. Facite
Facite valiatis.